that suffering that we're experiencing is because of the misunderstanding of the nature of reality, that we're mistaking the unreal, meaning the apparent world appearance, for the real.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Soul Sessions. I'm Deborah Burnt Maldonado, and I'm here with Robert Maldonado, and we are founders of Creative Mind, and we're continuing our series on Eastern wisdom, based on the wisdom of the Upanishads.
Yes, and we're talking about the transformation of suffering into wisdom.
Yes, how to transform your suffering into wisdom. And before we get started today, I want to remind you, if you'd like to stay tuned to every episode, go to Spotify, iTunes, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. And if you're watching us here on YouTube, there's a button here in the corner you can click and subscribe to our channel. So let's get started. Suffering. How do we turn that into wisdom? I mean, everyone can relate to suffering.
Yes. So we begin with the story of Arjuna in the middle of the battle. So most of you are familiar with the Bhagavad Gita. It is the story of these two families that are at war with each other. Or actually, it's one family that's at war with each other.
We can all relate to that.
That's right. The camps are kind of split between that family where there's uncles, parents, brothers, cousins on both sides ready to fight each other. Mm-hmm. So the whole Gita takes place right in the middle of that battle. The armies are about to clash, and Arjuna, who is one of the leaders of the main group, the Pandavas, for his charioteer has none other than Krishna himself, representing the divine. And so he asked Krishna to drive the chariot to the middle of the field, right between the two armies about to clash. And he loses his nerve. He says, seeing this situation, this impossible war, that if we win, we would have to kill grandparents, uncles, cousins, and if we don't win, if we lose the kingdom, and I lose my brothers, and so there is no real winning in that kind of situation.
It's a losing battle. Yeah,
it's a lose battle, absolutely.
And we kind of feel that way with life, that we're fighting this battle that we can never win.
Yeah. And so he becomes very dejected and depressed and drops his bow and arrow, essentially, and thus begins Krishna's teachings, where he instructs him on the proper conduct in such a unwinnable situation.
How do I deal with this impossible situation?
Yes. And it's a good starting point for us because we're talking about samsara, suffering, and it takes a little bit of thinking through this and a little bit of explanation, so bear with us. If we go back to what the Upanishads teach, and really the Gita is considered like a summation or distillation of the wisdom of the Upanishads. In other words, what Krishna teaches Arjuna is precisely the Upanishads. He precisely says, this is the wisdom you need to face this unwinnable war that you're facing. So the Upanishads simply state this, that we suffer because we mistake the unreal for the real and the real for the unreal. So what does that mean? If we go back a little bit to how we're born into this world, and we perceive things to be separate from us. Right? We use our senses to observe the world around us, and we see colors, objects, forms, other people, animals, nature, the great cosmos beyond us. That experience, the Upanishads explain, confuses us because the way the world appears to us, it appears to be separate from us. It appears to be out there, whereas we feel to be inside our head or inside our body anyway.
And they have, as they say in Buddhism, that independent arising, that statement of that there's these things that are independent of our mind that are happening outside of us.
Very much so. So if we just think in, because what we're trying to do in our work is look for the psychology of these spiritual teachings. What is the psychology behind that so that we can use it in our coaching process, in our teaching. So if we go back to this idea, okay, so we're born into a body or with a body, and we observe objects to be separate from us. And
we believe we're an object too, right? We believe we're an object in the world.
Well, let's say we desire objects because we need food and we need shelter. Therefore, we move towards the things that give us pleasure and try to stay away from the things that hurt us.
And sometimes it's not even pleasure, it's security, safety. It's not like a joy pleasure. Sometimes it's more the pleasure of feeling secure.
Yeah, I mean, we can think of the hierarchy of needs here. You have to start with the basics and then move up. You won't want to create poetry if you're hungry. You need to be satiated first and have food. Then you can go on to the higher needs. But at the basic level, yeah, we need to survive. Therefore, we need shelter, food, comfort, etc. And we need to stay away from danger, of course, make sure we survive.
So there's a lot of levels to that pleasure and moving away from pain. And it's also social, too. We have these social needs that are not about kind of feeling safe in a group, feeling safe in the familiar.
Absolutely. But at the basic level, then, we have objects, right? We have the world out there and me as a body in here. What that does, then, that duality of good and bad, because the mind has to discern what is good for me and what is bad for me. In other words, what leads to fulfillment of those needs and what leads to not acquiring those needs. That duality then gives rise to the sense of ego, the sense of I.
The part of you that wants to protect this body.
That's right.
Basically, it's a mechanism or a function that says this body is important. It's more important than any other body, and I need to protect it.
Yes, this is what is called it's like a function that arises out of the need out of perception. So it's like an apparent self, but it's not real.
Kind of like Avatar. It's like an avatar in the world.
Yeah, because it's almost saying like if there is a need to move towards comfort and safety and a need to ward off pain and suffering, there must be somebody doing that.
Or something that suffers and something that enjoys or suffers.
Yes.
Or someone.
And that gives rise to that I.
Makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Yeah.
It's so simple but hard to practice
right.
as
So,
we go through this.
So that I then, the Upanishads say, is confusion because that's not who you are. You are the pure awareness, but you start to believe I must be the I because I'm actively seeking comfort, and these things give me comfort, food, shelter, and these other things give me pain and suffering. Therefore, I need to move away from them. And that becomes solidified, or it feels solid to us, that there is this I in me in my body, in my mind, that is the real me. And it says that's the first step towards samsara, towards the creation of more suffering for ourselves, because it's a false assumption that we're making.
So when I was first starting personal development, they would say, use affirmations like, I am good enough, I am smart. So is that reinforcing the ego? I'm attracting more money every day. I'm finding the love of my life. I am loved. I'm lovable.
Yeah.
That would be what the ego thinks, like it builds this character, and then it associates things in the outer world to define itself at the same time. Not only safety, but almost its identity, its self-concept gets connected to, if I have this money or I get this house or buy this car or have this relationship, I am something.
Very much so. So that is what is meant by mistaking the unreal for the real. So that we start to believe the objects in the world, the appearance of the world is real. And the things in my mind, my imagination, my thoughts,
your dreams even
are less real.
Yeah, or even your spiritual nature is not as real, or things that you can't see.
That's right. The things that we can't see. Let's say at that point we haven't even investigated who is the I, right?
Yeah.
We're simply assuming that the I is this body, this need, this apparent need that I have for safety and comfort and food, and the moving away from pain, etc. That's that duality.
And the I really doesn't have imagination because it's only making its assumptions on what it can see with the senses. So when you think about possibilities or changing your life or doing something different, your ego I will not identify with that because it's always just looking at, well, what's real? Let's be reasonable. Let's be rational. Let's see what we created before. And that's how it really creates the future from the past.
Yes.
And in that way, it feels that we're not that it creates suffering because we get stuck. I love the metaphor that we talked about this before, but my favorite metaphor, I use this a lot when I'm coaching my clients, of this unreal and real, is that we've all had an experience of similar to this, but imagine that you walked into a dark room and there was a rope on the floor, but the room was dark, so you mistook that rope for a snake. You immediately tense up, freak out. I would. I mean, maybe someone wouldn't want to wrestle with it, but most people would freak out, wondering if the snake is dangerous. Is it going to bite me? Is it going to hurt me? So our defenses come in. The ego kicks in to save you, preserve the body. And then you turn on the light, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, it's a rope. And immediately you relax. So did you experience the snake? Even though it wasn't there? Yes, you had an experience of pain and suffering and fear. You can't deny that. That experience is real. But when you turned on the light, you realize that the experience was unreal. And so that's what life is that we get caught up in seeing snakes everywhere when we haven't turned the light on and shined our higher wisdom to understand who we really are, to see that there's nothing to fear and what the true nature of the reality we're in is. And so, again, you're not denying saying the world is an illusion and it's not real, because we do have real experiences of suffering, but the suffering is within us. It's not in the external object.
Yeah, that's a beautiful metaphor that when we see the world then through the samsara, through the suffering, we're seeing the snake. We're thinking this rope, this neutral world, the way it's appearing to us, is actually a snake. It's dangerous. It's harmful. It's something I have to be very cautious about. Well,
wouldn't you say too, like we all can relate to worrying about something? worrying if things are going to work out, like maybe going to a doctor's appointment, getting a test, or worrying if the relationship's going to work out, and you're worrying. I call it pre-suffering because it hasn't happened yet, but you're suffering already, and advanced suffering. And then everything works out, and then you're, okay, I feel better. But you suffered that whole time based on your mind projecting into the future this worst case scenario and what it means. And that's what the ego does all the time. It's always looking for danger and creating suffering about something that may or may not never happen. As Mark Twain famously said, a lot of terrible things happen in my life, but mostly none of them actually turned out to be true.
Right. Yeah. So the psychological understanding then of human suffering, we're starting to get closer to it. It's based on a misapperception of the world. Mm-hmm. Our perceptual systems, our organs tell us this is the world. It's a snake, basically. It's out there, and it appears dangerous or daunting, and it's causing us suffering. It's causing us fear, anxiety, trepidation, but in reality, it's that suffering that we're experiencing is because of the misunderstanding of the nature of reality, that we're mistaking the unreal, meaning the apparent world appearance, for the real, that we think it's real, and therefore we persist in suffering.
So kind of like a nightmare when you wake up and you're being chased by something, or something terrible's happening, and you're feeling those feelings in your body, and you wake up and it was just a dream. It's sort of like that. The samsara happens also in our dream world.
Yes, and so let's address this, because a lot of you might know samsara from the Buddhist terminology. We're not talking in that sense. We're talking more in the original sense of from the Upanishads, where samsara is very much related to Maya. So Maya is the apparent universe, the way it appears to us. But Maya itself is not necessarily suffering, because it's simply the expression of the cosmos, the way it appears, the way it organizes itself and appears to us. But samsara is our individual misperception that causes our suffering, that intensifies our individual suffering, and kind of throws us into that, just very similar to Arjuna, to that state where we feel like, I can't fight the world. It's too big. It's too much. It's suffering. There's nothing I can do about it. And so
it's like no matter what I do, I'm going to suffer.
Yes, we kind of feel like giving up. We feel dejected, powerless against this incredible force of suffering.
Well, I found it too when I had certain things I wanted in my life, and then I received them. It was never enough. That you can get into that, oh, okay, I have this new house and it's really nice, but then I want the next thing, and that kind of craving the ego has for more, and dissatisfaction, because it thinks that these things are going to give you happiness. And then sometimes we get disappointed because, we got that new car smell. And I remember you and I talked about this one time. You had this new car, and then after a while you were like, it's just a car. But we have this idea in our mind that this is going to bring us something more. And so we have these moments of seeing the illusion of that reduction of suffering through a temporary, positive thing that happens in our life, but it's not lasting, it's fleeting. And so that's what samsara is. It's like a bucket with holes in it, and it can never be filled. When you're coming from the perception of the ego.
Yes, and our interpretation, and again, keep in mind that we're using, or we're looking at this higher knowledge from the perspective of philosophy, of psychology, so that we definitely respect people that understand it in a religious way and practice it, and by all means continue to do that. We encourage that. But we want to understand the psychology of it so that maybe everyone can use it for their own enlightenment, for their own wisdom. From the psychological perspective now, the idea of rebirth, right? Because samsara, the term, is tied to that cycle of birth and death, continuously, cyclically rotating, giving rise to continuous births and deaths. But if we look at it from the philosophical perspective, the way the Upanishads were written, they were not written from a materialistic perspective. To them, this was not a material universe as we conceive it now.
Which is interesting because now the quantum scientists are doing research and they're saying, oh, well, what they said thousands of years ago, this is what they were talking about when they were talking about consciousness, and that the perception and the observer actually has the power to shape the reality, and that is mind-blowing, right?
That's right. They were written in a paradigm that says everything is consciousness, everything is awareness. So if you think of a pure awareness, and actually you can't think of it because our thoughts are essentially designed to think in objective terms and thinking of objects. The pure awareness would be like the space in which things arise. So instead of look around in the room that you're at right now, you see objects, right? And your mind is trained and conditioned to look at objects and to perceive them.
Or not really see the space, right?
Yes, exactly. The space is the awareness where these objects are existing and arising. And that is consciousness. So when we consider the universe from that perspective, what it means is that everything we see in the cosmic realm, in the whole universe, galaxies, planets, all these beautiful things, they are arising within consciousness. They're not separate from consciousness.
There's nothing outside of consciousness.
That's right. In the West, we're used to thinking of consciousness as like our awareness of objects.
We're conscious of something,
yes,
and this is
ability
different.
to think or to perceive. That's more cognition. But in the Eastern philosophy, in the Upanishads, consciousness is the substance out of which everything is made, including what we perceive as material objects.
And that's what they're discovering, that as they go down into atoms and subatomic particles and quarks, they can't find anything solid in it, and it's more like it's like a intelligence that they're discovering that isn't bound by the laws of physics. It's like a quantum physics, and it's strange, and so it's interesting that it took us thousands of years to start to, find that through mathematics to how this relates together.
So when we read then the idea of rebirth, of continuously cycling through life and death, from
like
that
cycle
perspective,
of suffering, right? It's like a cycle.
Yes, from the perspective of a consciousness universe, meaning that everything is arising within like one field of awareness, one field of consciousness. That's a very different interpretation, because then we don't start to think in terms of individual bodies dying and then being reborn.
Or there's like a soul that is material that goes somewhere else outside of consciousness and goes to some other realm and then comes into another body in that physical material concept. But if in religion, it makes more sense from the materialistic concept. If we hear rebirth and reincarnation and things like that, it makes more sense to us if we're in a material universe that it's a physical experience. But what you're saying is it's a conscious experience. It's appearing in consciousness, which means that there's no matter, but it's all one. And there's no separation again.
Right, because now if you think about this, if it's saying that even your body, right, this physical body that we experience to be born and to die, is within that consciousness and experiencing the world, which is also consciousness, then it doesn't make sense that you would be going from one body to another in that physical way that's interpreted, or that reincarnation is often interpreted as.
Well, you would assume that you and that new body are separate.
If we, let's say, bring it down to a practical matter, then why would it teach us this if it wasn't for us to use or to understand? If we interpreted it in the sense that it was written, let's say in a paradigm of consciousness, that everything is occurring within this one consciousness, then we can understand it in a better way, because what it's saying is that the false sense of I is what's being reborn continuously. Whenever we perceive or misperceive the world of duality, it reinforces a sense of I, meaning it's reborn.
So a great example would be someone who's in their passion and their painting, and they're just in that creative flow. Their I is gone. Their I isn't saying, "Oh, I'm such a great painter," or "These are great colors," or "I hope people like it." It's like you're just creating, and then when you get criticized about it, the I pops up, right? So that would be a good example of us losing the I temporarily, and we can all experience that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what they mean, or what the Upanishads mean, and this is our interpretation, of course. Like I say, we respect people that have their own unique interpretation and practices based on that. But our interpretation from the philosophical, psychological perspective is that what the Upanishads are saying is that the I is continuously reborn because of our attachment to objects, our misperception of what the world is, because it begins with that understanding that you're mistaking the unreal for the real. In other words, you're thinking that the objects, the physical appearance of the world is real, which gives rise to that individual I, which is the false sense of I, which leads to our suffering. So that's the wheel of suffering that it's talking about. Very much in the moment. It continuously recreates that when we misperceive the world. In other words, we're continuously seeing the snake instead of perceiving the rope that is there.
So would that be how does that relate to conditioning? Because everyone can relate to conditioning. And would that be that we're conditioned to believe we're the ego, and that almost like a habit of seeing ourselves in a false sense, seeing us attached to our body and this object as the kind of who we are, just this physical body?
Yeah, I would say that it is the deeper foundation of what the ego is. And then we can understand conditioning to be that interaction with the objects. That when we get a positive, in other words, when we obtain something that gives us pleasure, food, shelter, whatever it is that we're seeking, we get reinforced, meaning the I is reinforced, meaning that false sense of me becomes stronger.
So to make ourselves free from suffering, because that conditioning creates suffering. Mm-hmm. So to make us free from suffering is when the ego's not activated, we are free of suffering.
Yes.
In a way. Like we have to find a way to stop identifying as the I for us to escape suffering of life.
Yes, because if you look at spiritual traditions from around the world from different times, they all have that in common. Their aim is to help the individual realize that false sense of themselves, that I, that ego, is not who they are.
Well, people hear self-actualization, self-realization. And when you think about consciousness, that's another word Jung called the self, and the Upanishads, the self, not the ego, but the self is this consciousness that we are, this oneness with everything. So realizing that's that idea of self-realization, self-actualization, is transcending the ego.
Very much so, because the ego is not the true self. And we see it in Jung psychology as well, that he's developing a psychology to help people move towards the true self, finding their true self, or really you are always the true self. There's nothing else you can be, but the covering, again, the appearance of the snake, the illusion of a snake, is what causes our confusion and therefore causes our suffering.
Because actually, there's no snake, but except in our mind. And so the way out of suffering is to transcend the ego. And the only time we suffer, when we are suffering, we have to remember, I must be attached to my ego, or I must be experiencing myself as ego. If I am suffering, it's a signal that you're seeing the world for a misperception. And so anytime we're triggered, anytime we feel that we're uncomfortable or dissatisfied in life, it's you're seeing the world through the eyes of the ego and not through your true self. Because the true self doesn't suffer. The true self can never be harmed, can never be burned, can never be damaged. Only the ego, or this concept of ego, can experience pain, suffering, traumas, hurts, heartache. All those things are because we think we're the ego.
So one of the biggest hindrances to crossing this ocean of samsara, this misperception, this illusory experience that we have of pain and suffering in the world, is higher knowledge. Higher knowledge is the boat that gets us across the ocean.
It's almost like carrying us. So we're not dipping into suffering. It's like carrying us. So we can experience the world. We can be in the world. It's not to reject it because it's not real, but we're seeing it from the right perspective. So then we can really enjoy, like a lot of people say, well, if it's unreal and I think I learn this, then can I not enjoy like love and romance and luxury and delicious food? And it's the opposite. We actually enjoy it more because it's not to relieve suffering. It's out of pure creation.
That's it.
And pure experience.
Yes. And I often say this to people that kind of come up with that argument, right? That there's no reason why we can't enjoy the world as long as we understand its nature. Mm-hmm. It's when we misperceive its nature, again, that we think the unreal is real, that we suffer. But there is a reality in all this. And that's also what we forget, that it's not only saying everything is an illusion, therefore you're lost,
or it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. No, it's saying that the reality is the awareness in you, because you are that awareness in which everything is arising.
So it's the witnessing the world. We need that witness to see it in a way, in the right way.
The witness, you mean there's
the pure awareness.
The pure awareness.
But individually, that witness is sort of that connection to the bigger self, that we're swimming in. But that individual awareness, we have, in our conscious mind, we have that awareness. We're aware that we're here. You're aware that you're listening to this. So that's kind of a taste of that pure awareness, because that you can be aware of your suffering, but the awareness isn't suffering. It's aware that your body is suffering, or that your mind is creating suffering. Otherwise you wouldn't know suffering if you wouldn't have an awareness of that. So there's that duality again of seeing, being in the body, being aware of yourself, and then the suffering is optional.
Yeah, so that's one of the philosophical difficulties in let's say, answering the question, how is the mind aware? And is that the same awareness that we're meaning when we say pure awareness?
Mm-hmm.
So the Upanishads say simply this: consciousness cannot be conditioned,
Mm-hmm.
but the mind, the human mind, is conditioned consciousness. So what that means, if we kind of tease that apart and examine that, what it's saying is we believe we're conditioned because of our attachment to the objects. Our very desire, our attachment to the objects makes it feel like we're conditioned, but we cannot be conditioned. Even the mind cannot be conditioned because you can't hold on to the objects. I mean, you can try.
Like you can't, the snake never bit you, right?
That's right. The world cannot hurt you unless you believe it hurts you. But when you believe it hurts you, that's the experience of suffering.
So, for example, if you are afraid of getting heartbroken in a relationship and you believe that you can be heartbroken in a relationship, you are going to experience heartbreak in a relationship. But if you don't believe that it's possible, it won't happen because you're not conditioned to believe that that's even a possibility. Would that be a way to look at it?
That's one way to think about it. Yeah, metaphors are good in this regards because there is no language, no real good language to express pure awareness because there are no objects in it. The objects are arising in it.
And just so you know, this is something you have to really study. This isn't something that you're going to be like, oh, I get it. I know it. I'm not conditioned awareness. I'm pure self. It takes study. So this episode is not going to make you enlightened by, just listening to it. It's a taste and introduction to this work. It's a deep, there's a lot more to get it in a direct way. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the ways to think about it is to think in terms of this pure awareness as a liquid, as water, or as an oil, sometimes it's described. When you pour it into something, like when you pour water into a glass, the water takes the shape of the glass. In other words, it becomes the thing that you pour it into, the form, the shape that you pour it into.
So the water's consciousness, and then the shape is your expectation of what you believe is who you are and what's possible and what you've been conditioned to experience.
What you believe is real. So if you believe the snake is real, you experience the snake. You experience the suffering and the fear that arises from that experience. That's how we're creating our life, our experience of the world. Consciousness is neutral. It's essentially, it will take any form that we expect to see from it.
So
in any shape we pour it into, if we pour it into a fearful mind, it becomes a fearful experience. If we pour it into an enlightened mind, it becomes an enlightened experience.
So consciousness moves through our body. And if we think of our body, and our mind is more beyond our body, but that kind of individual sense of who we are, the consciousness pours into it, and it's like limited by the past conditioning and the, not limited, but it appears to feel, it gives you an experience of limitation based on that experience. But but you really are free to transcend it if you can understand. So you're not stuck in your conditioning. There's a freedom outside of it. But if you believe that you're the sum of the past of everything that happened to you, and you build your expectations and your identity on that past experience and that ego experience, that's going to be your predictive life. You're going to keep having the same results. The same suffering is that the rebirth? You keep getting reborn into the same suffering, like a wheel of karma that you can't escape because you're looking at the world the same way. I think you had a quote on our Instagram where you said that you have to look at the world differently in order to have a different experience.
Yeah, because as human beings, we operate on this principle of a narrative. So your ego, for example, has a history, and it constructs this narrative of who you are based on past experiences. And we carry that around in our head. It is not a real thing because nobody else can see it except us.
So if someone says, like, I'm never going to be successful, that narrative dictates their experience and that suffering. And then it'll appear as though out there they're battling something external, like Arjuna in the battle, that I have to battle the world. But you're kind of bringing in that idea that you're not good enough or that you're never going to succeed. And then that's what you keep getting. But then you think it's the world that's giving it to you versus your mind creating it. So that would be a way that we stay in suffering.
Yes, that's the rebirth.
Yeah.
We recreate our narrative continuously, moment after moment. Therefore, the world appears continuous to us and stable, and it makes sense. So there you see the function of it, that it's useful in that it gives us a sense of continuity, that it is me who went through a certain experience and learned a certain way of doing things. It's useful for survival mechanisms or for survival purposes, but it's not freedom in the true sense of the word, because we're locked into the limitations of that narrative.
Yeah.
And
then it feeds back to us, which reinforces the narrative, and it's this loop. See, I told you it's hard.
That's right.
Like if it's too hard, there's not enough, it's never going to happen. We are just speaking and creating, spinning. We all hear your thoughts create your life, but it's also not just your thoughts, but the emotional body. What, like you're feeling like the snake you didn't just think, oh, that's a snake, I should be afraid. You had an unconscious reaction to it. So most of what we're seeing is this unconscious pattern that we've been taught, and we kind of we forget almost like how it got started, and we just assume it's real. So we're so used to being a certain way, or the world being a certain way, that we just assume it's just the way it is.
That's right.
And there's no other way. So let's talk about how someone could, how do you escape samsara? Not escape, but how do you get yourself out of the suffering? How do you relieve your suffering?
Yes, so if we think back to this misapperception of the world as the cause, or the pretty close to what the cause is, but it's our ignorance of that experience that's really holding us back. Meaning that we're simply believing that our senses are telling us something true when they're not. Our senses are really designed to help us survive, not to give us the ultimate reality. So the ultimate reality is, again, that pure awareness that we mentioned. The
pure possibility, pure potential.
That's the real you, and that is what you can count on, what you can stand on. It is the ground of being that never shifts, and it's stable.
Where the ego is always shifting, and always.
Well, the world is always shifting because that's its nature. It's Maya, its appearance. It's always in flux.
Movement.
Therefore, to put your money on the external is a losing bet, because it's always going to change. It's never going to give you what you expect it to give you. And expecting the world to give you happiness, stability, safety, that's the cause of suffering, right? It begins that cycle of misapperception, putting your hopes and dreams on something that cannot be stable. Therefore, you're creating your own suffering. So the answer is knowledge. because if it's ignorance of
Is the
that
problem.
mechanism
Yeah.
that's causing the whole wheel of samsara to spin, then awareness, meaning higher knowledge of the true awareness of the true nature of yourself, the true self in you, that is the way out of that samsaric cycle of suffering.
So where can someone get this? How does someone go about finding? And for me, it's when I was first introduced to the higher knowledge, because I learned, I always read books on Buddhism, and they made a lot of sense, but I was trying to figure it out on my own. And I remember when you gave me a couple books, I think you gave me the Gita, and my mind just went, I have no idea what this means. It was so confusing to me, but I had to read it over and over and then ask you questions because you understood sort of what the metaphors mean, and also listening to lectures by swamis and reading more about it. You start to see, oh, I get what they're saying here. And so at first it's very confusing because we're conditioned to see the world in a certain way. And this higher knowledge basically turns it on its head. It's almost like ignorance is on one side and the higher knowledge is like everything you've learned is wrong, not wrong, but it's incorrect as far as what's the true nature. And it's turning everything on its head. And the ego will try to resist this new knowledge because it wants you to stay in ignorance, because it's not that it's mean, but it's just kind of the pattern of being in the body. And so it's the challenge of every person. It's not, and we're not talking about ignorance like in non-smart, non-intelligence, but ignorance in the lack of higher knowledge.
Yeah, so let's define higher knowledge, because let's say that implies lower knowledge, right? Or a different kind of knowledge. So ordinary lower knowledge is knowledge of the world because, again, it's an appearance. So knowledge of that appearance is good, right? It helps us survive again, and it helps us build cars and planes and all the stuff we see.
Engineering, science, biology, physiology.
Yeah, it's
mathematics.
It's lower knowledge because it is knowledge of the objects, not the knower, not the observer, not the witness, like you say, or the pure awareness.
I love that. That's a great distinction.
So higher knowledge is knowledge that teaches you about the true nature of the self, the true self. Any knowledge that points to that awareness, that's higher knowledge. And the purest higher knowledge that we've seen on this planet is the Upanishads. It is the manual for consciousness, for what is the nature of your mind, what is the nature of reality.
And it's not a religion, it's a philosophy, it's understanding.
Yes.
And for me, after your ego wrestles with it, you become so free. You realize that anything you're bothered in the world about, the Upanishads has an answer to help you free your mind from that suffering. The mind is causing the suffering, not the world. And so you can read higher knowledge, but I found that the best way to learn higher knowledge is to have a teacher or a coach that is trained in higher knowledge, not a coach that's going to tell you about the world that you know, like maybe your thoughts and feelings. That's more lower knowledge, but it's the awareness of that. Like, what's the awareness behind your thoughts and feelings? What's the awareness behind your conditioning? That is higher knowledge. And so having someone guide you is the fastest way to really integrate it and have a direct experience of it, because the ego wants to hide it from you. So it's almost as if you try to do it yourself, it sort of has trapdoors and leads you back to it's one of those mazes that you end up at the beginning again. And because your ego is like tries to rationalize and say, oh, here, this makes a lot of sense, almost like bypassing the real truth to get you to not go deeper. And when things are confusing, I found, I used to read a lot of like the pop psychology, self-help books, and it just made a lot of sense. And I felt like, wow, this is really great. And it didn't challenge me. But when I started reading the Gita and the Upanishads, it really made me think. It really made me question everything I thought. And when you're getting that kind of knowledge and you have a coach that challenges what your mind is seeing, what your mind is assuming, that's really where you can start to escape suffering or transcend the suffering and stop the cycle.
Yeah, it is very much like waking up, like the Buddha says, right? Yeah, there's no difference between me and all human beings. It's simply that I'm awake. You wake up to the reality of things. Instead of seeing the snake, the appearance of things as real, you start to understand, oh, I am the real. My awareness is the real, not the objects that I see appearing in that awareness.
So just remember, we're going to be continuing the series, but just remember that anytime we feel triggered and we feel this suffering of our mind, ask yourself, I'm not seeing things the right way. If I'm suffering, there's something I'm missing. There's something I'm not seeing. And just sit with that feeling and ask yourself, like, what is this about? Where is my misperception? Listen to this episode again. Start to see where is my ego caught up in this? And because once you realize and recognize how the ego's caught up, it's almost that light turning on in that room, and you start to see the rope and not the snake. So we will see you next week, continuing our series on higher wisdom. And I really enjoyed sharing this with you today. Again, if you'd like to continue to listen to our podcast, please, if you're on Spotify, iTunes, all the podcast hosting services, please subscribe to us, Soul Sessions by Creative Mind. Or if you're on YouTube here, watching us on video, click the button in the corner that says subscribe and make sure you don't miss any episode as we continue to help you free your mind and get out of suffering.
See you next time.
Take care, everyone.